Hi, MiraCostans. Joe Silverman here. I'm going to try something called Camtasia. Basically put some voice to these lectures, these PowerPoint lectures, the ones that I would normally give in class. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break this particular lecture up into a couple sections. One deals with trade, and the other one is other section is where we're going to get into the basics of supply and demand. So normally I would ask questions, but it's kind of hard to to do that in an online setting like this. So I'm just going to skip through this. And the example that I'd like to use to see whether or not two countries can trade is looking at two different production possibility frontiers for wheat and oranges for two different countries. These are all fictional. One country is the United States. In this particular production possibility frontier for the U.S., we can see that if the U.S. put all its resources into producing oranges, it could produce 1,500,000 tons of oranges. On the other hand, if we in the U.S. put all our resources into producing wheat, we could produce 1,500,000 tons of wheat. The points connecting those two extremes on the production possibility frontier is a straight line. So that tells us that we have constant opportunity cost. That is a production possibility frontier that's easier to deal with. Then what we see is we've got some points that are feasible that are somewhere in between those two extremes. So for instance, this point over here, which we'll call C, it looks like in the US we'd be able to produce about 900,000 tons of oranges and 600,000 tons of wheat. Or if we go over here to this point, we'll call this E, it looks like we can produce 1,200,000 tons of wheat or 300,000 tons of oranges. So any of the points along the line are feasible points, feasible and efficient. Any of the points within the production possibility frontier within the line are also feasible, but they'd be inefficient. All right, so that's the production possibility frontier we see for the United States. The other country is Brazil, and Brazil also produces wheat and oranges. They also have a production possibility frontier with constant opportunity cost, but the quantities of wheat and oranges that Brazil produces is a little bit different. So according to this production possibility frontier, if Brazil put all its resources into producing oranges, it could produce 500,000 tons of oranges. On the other hand, if they put all their resources into producing wheat, they could produce 250,000 tons of wheat, or points in between. Like for instance, this one over here looks like it would be 300,000 tons of oranges and 100,000 tons of wheat. And what we want to do is we want to compare the quantities of both wheat and oranges in Brazil and the United States and try to determine whether or not it's feasible for Brazil and the United States to get together and trade in a way that's mutually beneficial. So what I've done here is summarized the amounts of wheat and oranges that both countries can produce. So this is a table for the United States that shows the quantities of wheat and oranges. This is a table for Brazil that shows the quantity of wheat and oranges. And one of the things that may jump out at you, one of the things I want you to consider when you're doing your analysis, I'm going to ask you in a little while to just to shut this off. I'll give you the cue to shut it off. I want you to look at these numbers. I want you to take in all the information that you have and ask yourself, is it possible for Brazil and the United States to trade in a way that works for both of them? So looking at this, we can see that the U.S. outproduces Brazil in oranges by something like 3-to-1. How do I get to how do I conclude that? Well, it looks like over here, if the U.S. put all its resources into producing oranges, it could produce 1,500,000 tons of oranges, whereas if Brazil put all its resources into producing oranges, it could only produce 500,000 tons of oranges, or at B, 1,200,000 compared to 400,000, that's still 3-to-1. 900,000 compared to 300,000, that's still 3-to-1. So the U.S. definitely produces way more oranges than Brazil does. Well, what about wheat? Turns out it's actually worse for Brazil. Why do I say that? Because it looks like the U.S. outproduces Brazil 6-to-1 when it comes to wheat. For instance, B over here, the U.S. coordinate we'll call B. We can produce 300,000 tons of wheat, whereas for Brazil they could only produce 500,000. If we go all the way out to the extreme, we can produce 1 million, we being the US, can produce 1,500,000 tons of wheat, and in Brazil, they can only produce about 250,000. So we outproduce Brazil 6-1 when it comes to wheat and 3-1 when it comes to oranges. What I'd like you folks to do is shut this video off and contemplate whether or not it's possible for Brazil and the United States to get together and trade in a way where both countries would benefit. I'm going to go to the next slide. So, once you've thought it over, start the video back up again, and let's see how your conclusions compare to the results. All right. So what I did over here was I created points based on our production possibility frontiers for Brazil and the United States that might determine where they were before specialization and trade, whether or not the two countries, how they might go about trading. And one of the things, actually, let me go back for a sec. I didn't mention this before, but maybe I didn't have to, or maybe I should have. If you look at these points, some of you might conclude that it's not really possible for Brazil and the United States to get together and trade because the United States outproduces Brazil pretty drastically in oranges 3-1 and even more drastically in wheat 6-1. But that's not the basis for trade. What we see over here in this table is that the United States has an absolute advantage over Brazil in the production of wheat and oranges. The basis for trade is comparative advantage, and the way we look at comparative advantage is by looking at the slopes of the production possibility frontier. So I want to go back to the U.S. production possibility frontier, and if we were to calculate the slope, we'd see that the relative slope is -1. In other words, if we want to produce one more unit of wheat, we've got to give up 1 unit of oranges. If, on the other hand, we want to produce one more orange, we've got to give 1 unit of wheat. So that's the ratio of wheat to oranges in the United States. What we're going to do is we're going to compare that to the ratio of wheat to oranges in Brazil to see whether or not Brazil has a comparative advantage. And it turns out that they do. They have a comparative advantage in oranges. Now, how do we know that? Because the slope of Brazil's production possibility frontier, this is one with constant opportunity cost, is -2. In other words, for each unit, for each orange that Brazil sacrifices, they only get half a wheat. Or if Brazil wants to pick up one more wheat, they have to give up 2 oranges. So oranges are something that Brazil is actually comparatively better at producing than wheat compared to the United States. So Brazil has a comparative advantage in producing oranges. So therefore, it is possible for both these two countries to trade in a way that'll work out well for both of them. So let's just imagine that before trade in the United States, we were producing 1,200,000 tons of wheat and 300,000 tons of oranges so that Americans could have breakfast cereal and orange juice in the morning when they sit down for breakfast. Imagine that in Brazil, they were also producing wheat and oranges, but they were only producing 200,000 tons of wheat and 100,000 tons of oranges. I just mentioned that Brazil has a comparative advantage in the production of oranges. So if they do, they're going to put all their resources into producing oranges, which means that they could produce as much as 500,000 tons of oranges. We don't have a comparative advantage. We have an absolute advantage, but it really doesn't make any difference whether we produce wheat or oranges. So if Brazil is going to produce oranges, then we should produce wheat. And what I'm saying over here is the U.S. will specialize in producing wheat and will produce 1,500,000 tons of wheat. Okay, that's great. People in the U.S. have breakfast cereal and no orange juice. People in Brazil have orange juice but no breakfast cereal. How are they going to solve this problem? People are going to get together. They're going to figure out how many oranges they want to trade for how much wheat. And so just imagine that people in the U.S. agree to sell Brazil, if you will, 250,000 tons of wheat in exchange for 350,000 tons of oranges. So what I'm doing over here is I'm subtracting 250,000 tons of wheat from the total produced in the U.S. That leaves American consumers with 1,250,000 tons of wheat, but we're adding 350,000 tons of oranges that are coming from Brazil. See, I subtracted 350,000 tons of oranges from Brazil's total, and I added it here to the US total. So now American consumers have 1,250,000 tons of wheat and 350,000 tons of oranges. What about in Brazil? Well, Brazil didn't produce any wheat, but they did get 250,000 tons of wheat from the US, so we'll add that to the amount that Brazilian consumers have to consume. And we have to subtract 350,000 tons of oranges from the amount that they produced. So Brazilian consumers have 150,000 tons of oranges left over after they sent 350,000 tons to the U.S. Man, there's a lot of numbers here. I mean, a lot of people might be saying, well, what's the point of this whole exercise? Well, we think back to the very beginning. What we're trying to figure out is whether or not people in the U.S. and Brazil could benefit from trade. And the way we're going to make that determination is by comparing domestic consumption after specialization and trade to how much consumers could consume in each country before specialization and trade. So one of the things we see is that after specialization and trade, American consumers can consume 1,250,000 tons of wheat, which is 50,000 tons more than they could before specialization and trade. And American consumers can consume 350,000 tons of oranges, which is also 50,000 tons more than American consumers could consume before specialization and trade. So people in the U.S. are better off. Some people would say, well, yeah, we kind of knew that. We were producing more than they were in Brazil anyway. All right, but what about in Brazil? It turns out that people in Brazil are also better off. So how do we know that? After specialization and trade, people in Brazil are able to consume 250,000 tons of wheat, even though they didn't grow any. All the wheat came from the United States, right? Before specialization and trade, though, they were growing 200,000 tons of wheat. Still, 250,000 tons of wheat is 50,000 tons more than 200,000, so Brazilian consumers are better off. What about in the orange department? Well, Brazil decided that it was going to produce 500,000 tons of oranges because that was their better resource. That was a better thing to produce with the resources they had. And they shipped 350,000 tons to the United States. That still left Brazilian consumers with 150,000 tons of oranges, which is 50,000 tons more than they had before. So the people in Brazil are better off as well. This is why, if previously, if you looked at these numbers and you said, I don't think it's really possible for these two countries to trade because the U.S. just outproduces Brazil by so much in wheat and oranges. If that's what you concluded, you fell into what I'd like to call the absolute advantage trap. Keep in mind, there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we learn. But if that's what you concluded, keep in mind that the basis for trade is not absolute advantage, being able to outproduce somebody, but the basis of trade is comparative advantage, being able to produce something at a lower opportunity cost. All right, so terms of trade, how much of one good was given up for something else? Well, it turns out that the terms of trade are 250,000 wheat for 350,000 oranges, right? How do we know that? We could say 25 to 35 or 250,000 to 350,000, but those are the terms of trade, how much of one good we gave up for the other. Or if you looked at it, I guess, from the Brazilians' perspective, 350,000 oranges for 250,000 wheat. Does that make sense? All right, how are the terms of trade determined? If we were sitting in class right now, I'd ask that question. Students would be like thinking about that, looking around. I'd get all kinds of answers. One type of answer I might get is that they looked at the prices. But in this particular example, we're not assuming that there are any prices. We're just looking at quantities. In other words, this is barter. We're not dealing with dollars and reals. We don't care about the exchange rate. There's no money involved. This is the earliest type of trade that took place, barter. One person has wheat, another person has oranges, right? So in this, I'll cut to the chase, I guess. In this example, I made up the terms of trade. I just looked for a number that would work. In reality, in the real world, the one that you live in, the terms of trade would be determined by negotiation. In other words, there's people who are growing oranges in one country people who are growing wheat in the other. They're trying to figure out how much they can get of one good for their good. They go back and forth and back and forth, and that's how they determine how much wheat is going to be exchanged for how many oranges. All right, transaction cost. One of the things that I hand waved away in this example, this is a classroom example, are things like transaction costs. So probably the biggest transaction cost would be something like shipping. If the cost of shipping oranges was too expensive, or if the cost of shipping wheat were too expensive, then even if these people could come to an agreement, even if they could decide how many wheat for oranges they wanted to exchange, it might not be viable if the transaction costs are too high. So just want to keep that in mind. What I'd like to do now is just end it here. And then I'm gonna do another recording where we start talking about supply and demand. Thank you very much, and please look for the other recording as well.